In March 12, 1902, workmen repairing the old Street Landry Parish courthouse struck through plaster and uncovered what history thought it had buried forever, a sealed ledger, hidden deep within the wall. Inside it lay a line that froze time itself. 2 mulatto infants, property of Wildermore Plantation, sold, $3 each. But what stunned them most was the scrap of paper tucked beside it, written in a woman's hand. They were mine. Let the world remember their names. The signature had faded, but historians would later whisper her name. Marianne Calder, the enslaved mother who gave birth in chains and whose children vanished into legend. The discovery reignited a century-old silence, forcing the South to remember what it had tried to forget. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. Let's see how far Marianne's story still travels. Because this is not just about the past. It's about remembrance, resistance, and the river that never forgets. Time has a way of burying what it cannot forgive. In 1902, during the renovation of an aging courthouse deep in the Louisiana lowlands, a mason's hammer struck the hollow sound of a secret. Behind a section of plastered brick lay a wooden ledger, its cover eaten by rot, its pages stiff with moisture and age. Within its faded ink and careful handwriting was a record so small it might have been overlooked had it not been so monstrous. 2 infants. Sold for 3 cents each. Less than the cost of a peppermint stick. The ledger was dated 1854, though the handwriting bore the precise calligraphy of a practiced clerk. Each line was ruled and measured, each transaction written as if it were arithmetic, not humanity. Among sales of furniture, livestock, and parcels of land appeared a single entry, written smaller than the rest, almost hidden between transactions for farm tools and seed. 2 mulatto infants, property of Wildermore Plantation, sold, $3 each. The ink had bled, but the meaning did not fade. The discovery stirred quiet horror among those who read it. The workers who unearthed the ledger sealed it back into the wall, leaving only whispers to carry its existence forward. The local newspaper made no mention. Parish records listed no investigation. Yet the few who saw it understood that the words on that page were more than commerce, they were confession. In the years before the Civil War, Louisiana's plantations were not merely farms, they were factories of lineage and loss, where women could be property and motherhood a transaction. Enslaved children were born into ownership before they drew their first breath. Their births were counted not by midwives, but by men with ink-stained hands. The law said a child followed the condition of the mother. To be born enslaved was to inherit chains before a name. What made this record so unusual was not the cruelty, it was the price. 3 cents. In a world where the worth of a human life was measured in hundreds of dollars, this valuation was deliberate humiliation. It spoke of punishment, of erasure, of a master's will carried out in silence. Somewhere in the parish, a woman had endured the unthinkable pregnancy in bondage, birth in captivity, and separation before her children had opened their eyes to daylight. The courthouse where the ledger was found still stands, its walls thick with humidity and history. Locals call it haunted. They say on some nights, if the rain falls hard enough, the smell of damp ink rises from the cracks in the plaster. They say you can hear the faint rustle of paper turning, as if the past itself were trying to be read again. Historians would later call the record the Wildermore entry. But to those who know the truth of such places, it was not an entry at all. It was evidence. Evidence that somewhere along the Mississippi's forgotten bend, a woman once gave birth in chains and her children were sold for less than the sweetness of a single piece of candy. Beneath the grand columns and decaying verandas of Wildermore Plantation, where the air never truly moved and the walls seemed to breathe with the weight of history, there was a room no one spoke of. It lay beneath the main house, below the pantry and the servant quarters, a cellar built not for storage but for silence. The walls were brick, thick and sweating with moisture from the earth, and in the far corner a single chain was bolted to the foundation. Its iron links were rusted, but its purpose had never faded. It was here that a young woman named Marianne was kept. She had been there for weeks, her body heavy with pregnancy, her ankles bruised where the shackle met skin. Her crime, the records would later reveal, was not theft or violence but defiance, a refusal to accept what had been forced upon her. To those who ruled Wildermore, her defiance was dangerous, not because it threatened their lives, but because it threatened their story. In a world built upon image and inheritance, silence was power, and Marianne had refused to be silent. The cellar was small, no wider than a carriage. The floor was packed earth mixed with straw, the air thick with the scent of damp iron and river rot. Above her, life continued as usual. The master entertained merchants in the parlor, his wife hosted tea on the veranda, and the overseer gave orders in the field. The house itself seemed unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that beneath its polished floors, a woman was chained for remembering she was human. The iron cradle of her captivity served a double purpose. It punished her for the scandal of her condition and ensured that her pregnancy remained unseen by guests and neighbors. The Calders, like many planters of their standing, believed appearances were the currency of civilization. To reveal Marianne's suffering would mean confessing to their own sins. So they buried her beneath brick in denial, praying that time and distance would cleanse what their conscience could not. Nights in the cellar were long and airless. Rain seeped through cracks in the ceiling, leaving muddy veins across the wall. Rats moved in the corners, and every creak of the house above reminded her that life continued without her. The midwives who brought her food rarely spoke, their eyes carrying the heavy knowledge of what was to come. Wildermore itself was a place of contradictions, a landscape where beauty and cruelty grew from the same soil. The magnolias bloomed white as bone, their perfume mingling with the smoke of the sugarcane fires. The river shimmered like glass in daylight but turned black and soundless at night. And beneath it all, beneath the song of crickets and the hum of distant machinery, was the heartbeat of a woman chained in darkness, waiting to bring life into a world that had already priced it for sale. The house at Wildermore stood like a relic pretending to be eternal. Its columns were cracked but still proud, its white paint long surrendered to mildew and time. Once, it had been the crown jewel of the Calder family, an estate carved from ambition and river soil, where every brick had been laid by hands that did not belong to those who owned it. By 1854, it was a monument to decline, a house trying desperately to remember what wealth felt like. Colonel Thaddeus Calder presided over this crumbling empire with the posture of a man who believed decay was only temporary. He was born into inheritance, raised on the illusion that lineage was armor. But the cotton had thinned, the sugar harvests had faltered, and the debts whispered louder than the hymns sung in church. The colonel still rose at dawn, still rode the perimeter of his land, but the power he once commanded had begun to slip like river silt through open fingers. His portrait hung in the study, painted years earlier when his uniform still fit, and his eyes held the conviction of a man untouched by consequence. Now, the flesh behind that portrait was grayer, heavier, and haunted by the knowledge that his empire was built on the exhaustion of others. His wife, Genevieve Calder, carried herself like the ghost of another century. She had come from Virginia, where her family's name once opened doors and set tables. Wildermore had been her cage and her inheritance. The Louisiana humidity had done what heartbreak could not. It wore her down slowly, until she moved through her home like someone walking through the remnants of a dream. The mirrors were covered in gauze to keep away dust, though some whispered she did it to avoid seeing her own reflection. Servants learned to speak softly in her presence. She could hear every lie but rarely spoke the truth. To the Calders, appearances were the only currency left. The fields might be barren, the ledgers might bleed red, but as long as Wildermore looked intact, they could pretend the rot had not yet reached the foundation. They held dinner parties for guests who never came, polished silver that would never see a table, and gave orders to servants who had stopped believing in them long ago. At night, the house whispered. The shutters creaked, the floorboards swelled, and the river breeze slipped through the cracked windows carrying the smell of the swamp and something older, something like regret. The Calders slept above the weight of their own sins, unaware that beneath their feet, in the cellar they never spoke of, their legacy was already unraveling. The house they called a home was not dying. It was remembering. August Holt was the kind of man who mistook obedience for virtue. At Wildermore, his word carried weight only because it was backed by the lash. He had arrived at the plantation a decade earlier, a drifter from Tennessee who claimed to have managed land before, though no one could find record of it. He came with little more than a horse, a pistol, and the hollow pride of a man who needed someone else's authority to survive. In Colonel Thaddeus Calder, he found both employment and purpose. Wildermore gave him the illusion of power, and Holt guarded it with the ferocity of someone who knew how fragile it truly was. The overseer's house stood just beyond the cane fields, its porch facing away from the big house as if ashamed. The furniture inside was crude, the walls thin, the air heavy with sweat and tobacco smoke. It was here that Holt learned how to weaponize fear. He measured worth in submission, believing that cruelty was not only effective but necessary. His voice could break silence faster than a whip, and his reputation stretched from one parish to the next. Yet beneath that performance of authority was something smaller, an unease that grew with every passing season. By the spring of 1854, the plantation's debts had reached a whispering point. Colonel Calder needed men who could keep the estate functioning, men who could keep the truth buried. The truth, in this case, was a woman locked in the cellar beneath the house, Mary Ann, whose body carried a scandal that could ruin what remained of the Calder name. Holt was summoned to the study one evening, and though no record of their conversation survives, the outcome is written between the lines of the parish books. Shortly after that night, the wages Holt was owed doubled, his duties were reduced, and a plot of land on the plantation's northern edge was promised to him. The bargain was clear. Silence for survival. Secrecy in exchange for the faint hope of inheritance. Holt agreed, because men like him always did. He did not see chains. He saw leverage. He told himself he was keeping order, that the world had always worked this way, that he was merely a part of something too large to change. But the truth was simpler. He feared the world beyond Wildermore. Without the Calders, he was nothing more than a man with no land, no name, and no legacy. In the years that followed, neighbors would remember August Holt as a man who walked with a limp and rarely looked anyone in the eye. They said he drank heavily, as if trying to wash something from his conscience that no amount of whiskey could touch. The land he had been promised never came, and the title he imagined himself worthy of died with the signature that was never written. But for a time, in that suffocating summer at Wildermore, August Holt held a power over life and silence, and he used it as if it might save him. Night fell heavy over Wildermore Plantation, thick with the weight of rain and memory. The fields lay silent except for the hum of insects and the groan of the river in the distance. Inside the big house, the candles had been extinguished early, as if the family hoped darkness could conceal what daylight had begun to whisper. Beneath those polished floors, beneath the worn rugs and marble hearth, a different kind of labor was unfolding, one that no guest or god would ever be permitted to see. The cellar where Mary Ann lay was not built for the living. It was meant to store barrels, tools, and silence. The walls wept with condensation, the air smelled of soil and rust, and the single oil lamp flickered with a reluctant flame. The iron shackle around her ankle remained in place, though her body strained and convulsed in pain. It was not loosened even as her child struggled to enter the world. 2 women had been summoned from the quarters under threat of the lash. Dinah, older and steady-handed, had delivered dozens of children who would never bear their mothers' names. Ruthie May, barely in her 20s, carried a kind of quiet terror that made her movements delicate, reverent, as though she feared the room itself might punish her for witnessing what it contained. They were given no explanation, only an order. Tend to the woman in the cellar, speak of nothing, and return before dawn. They worked by the thin light of the lamp, guided by instinct more than medicine. Outside, thunder rolled across the swamp, and each rumble seemed to shake the foundation of the house. The master was away that night, but his absence did not soften the air. His shadow still lingered on every wall, in every chain, in every breath the women dared to take. The cries that came from the corner were the kind that blurred the line between pain and defiance. No hymns were sung, No prayers spoken aloud, only the sound of rain and flesh and whispered fear. When the first cry came, it was not from the mother but from the newborn. A thin, startled wail that filled the small room like the echo of something sacred. Then another. Two voices, overlapping, fragile, alive. The twins were born pale, their skin light enough to reveal the truth that everyone in the house already suspected, but no one dared to speak. In that moment, the room grew colder. Even the lamp seemed to falter. The midwives cleaned the infants with torn linen, wrapping them in what little cloth they could find. They did not look at Marianne for long. To meet her eyes was to confront the enormity of what had been done. Above them, the storm raged against the roof, and the house creaked under its own weight, as though it too understood the gravity of what it was sheltering. By dawn, the cries had quieted. The rain eased to a whisper. Somewhere above, a door closed softly, and the world continued as if nothing had changed. But in the damp cellar of Wildermore, amid chains and blood and the fading scent of iron, two new lives had entered a world that had already decided their worth. Morning came to Wildermore wrapped in mist. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and sugarcane, the kind of morning that made the world feel still before it began to breathe again. Yet beneath that silence, something irreversible had occurred. Two new lives had entered the world under the flicker of a single lamp, born into chains and secrecy. A boy and a girl, twins. Their skin was pale, far lighter than their mother's, their eyes a soft gray that caught the lamplight like glass. They were living proof of a truth the Calder family could never admit, that power had trespassed where love was forbidden. Even before their first breaths had steadied, their existence had become a problem to be solved, a stain to be erased from the household story. The midwives who brought them into the world saw what others would pretend not to. They did not speak it aloud, but their silence said everything. In the cellar, the lamp guttered, its flame surrendering to dawn. Dinah, the elder of the two midwives, pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer not meant for ears but for mercy. Ruthie Mae's eyes shifted toward the ceiling, where footsteps moved faintly above them, the slow, deliberate rhythm of those who already knew. Neither woman would speak of what they saw, not because they lacked courage, but because words could not protect what was born beneath Wildermore that night. The twins' cries were small, unsteady, but they carried a strange clarity in that heavy air. For a few brief moments, the sound rose above the shame and the silence, a reminder that life persisted even in captivity. But soon the cries faded, replaced by the measured calm of those who had learned to listen without reaction. The overseer, August Holt, stood in the doorway long enough to see the truth for himself. His eyes flickered once, and then turned away. For him, the sight was confirmation that the secret he was paid to guard had become a living, breathing burden. Outside, the plantation stirred awake. Horses were watered, fields called for labor, and the Calder house prepared for another day of rehearsed civility. None of it reflected what had taken place below. The world above carried on with its rituals of wealth and control, while beneath it, two fragile beings unclaimed, unnamed lay wrapped in rags beside the woman who had carried them through suffering. In another time, they might have been cherished. But at Wildermore, their existence was proof of sin, not innocence. Theirs was not a birth celebrated, but a secret buried, a reminder that in this world, even life itself could arrive already condemned. Genevieve Calder had not slept in 3 nights. The silence of Wildermore was heavier than usual, filled with the kind of stillness that precedes confession. The storm had passed, leaving the house washed in pale gray light, and for the first time in days, the air smelled clean. Yet within the grand bedroom of the mistress of the house, that light felt invasive. It crept across the lace curtains and touched the edges of the mirror she had covered with cloth, as though determined to show her what she refused to see. She had always believed herself a woman of refinement, a guardian of order and grace. But beneath the surface of that cultivated poise ran a quiet desperation. Genevieve Calder's world had been built on appearances, white gloves, silver tea sets, and Sunday scripture, but appearances required constant tending. Every whisper had to be managed, every blemish concealed. She had spent her life ensuring Wildermore remained untarnished in the eyes of others, even as decay ate away at its foundations. Now, in the wake of the seller's secret, she understood that all her careful control had been an illusion. The servants spoke in lowered voices, their eyes shifting whenever she entered a room. She could feel the weight of what they knew pressing against her composure. Somewhere beneath the house, a woman had given birth. The twins' pale skin and gray eyes confirmed what she had feared but could not admit aloud. They were her husband's children, and their existence was an offense no amount of prayer could cleanse. By dawn, she had made her decision. It was not spoken in rage or grief, but in the cold, precise tone of someone who has already decided that mercy is a weakness. The children would not stay. They would not grow under her roof, not crawl across her floors or cry within earshot of her husband's study. Her voice, when she gave the order, was steady enough to sound like reason. But behind that steadiness was the quiet shattering of something once human. The household moved with mechanical obedience. The midwives obeyed. The overseer waited for instruction, and the walls of Wildermore absorbed the sound of history repeating itself. Above the parlor, Genevieve sat motionless at her vanity, staring at her reflection through the thin veil of cloth. She looked older than she remembered, her features sharp with exhaustion, her eyes hollow but dry. She told herself she was protecting her home, her marriage, her name, but what she preserved that morning was far less noble. When the sun rose fully, Wildermore looked untouched from the outside. The magnolias still bloomed white along the lane, and the porch gleamed with the false promise of peace. Yet beneath that calm veneer, something irrevocable had been set in motion. In protecting her dignity, Genevieve Calder had condemned 3 souls to ruin: the woman in the cellar, the children who bore her husband's blood, and herself, whose heart would never again know rest. The house had demanded a sacrifice, and she had given it willingly. Every story of power has its paper trail. In Louisiana, during the middle of the 19th century, that trail was written in ink, the color of dried blood. In the courthouse of Street, Landry Parish, where sunlight filtered through warped glass, and the smell of tobacco clung to everything, the most terrible crimes did not need to be whispered. They were recorded, bound. The cruelty of the age was not hidden. It was clerical. Ephraim Pruitt was a man of his time, meticulous, cautious, and quietly ambitious. He believed in order, in the sanctity of records, and in the illusion that the act of writing something down removed him from the weight of its morality. He wore spectacles even when he did not need them, a habit that made him appear studious, detached, professional. His penmanship was his pride. Each letter precise, each word properly aligned, as though neatness could make inhumanity civilized. When the document arrived from Wildermore Plantation, he treated it like any other deed of sale. The parchment was folded neatly, sealed in wax, and carried by a man on horseback who did not speak much. Pruitt broke the seal, smoothed the paper, and read what was written. There was no preamble, no sentiment, just inventory. 2 mulatto infants, property of Wildermore Plantation, sold, 3 cents each. He paused, perhaps only for a second, and then copied the information into the parish ledger with the same calm precision that he used for a transaction involving a mule or a plow. The price struck him as strange. 3 cents. Too little even for ink and paper, far below the cost of a loaf of bread or a handful of nails. For a moment, the absurdity of it registered, but he wrote it anyway. It was not his place to question, only to record. History, he would later tell himself, was built by men who kept their hands clean and their pens steady. But some stains never fade, not even in ink. Years later, long after the war had ended and the courthouse had been rebuilt, Ephraim Pruitt would die alone in his home. Among his few belongings, a small journal was found. In one of its final entries, he wrote about that morning in 1854. "They were infants," the note read. "I remember because the document was so brief, the sale so small it hardly seemed worth the paper. But that price, 3 cents each, I never forgot it. Candy cost 5. That confession, scrawled decades too late, became the only trace of conscience in a record otherwise defined by silence. Today, the page still exists, preserved behind glass, its ink faded but legible. And when you look at it closely, you can almost see the hesitation in the clerk's hand, the faint tremor of a man who, for one brief moment, realized he was recording not a sale, but a sin. The morning the children were sold, the river lay still, reflecting the pale sky like a sheet of dull metal. The courthouse square was half empty, the air heavy with humidity and indifference. To the few men who gathered, the sale of 2 infants was nothing remarkable. Such transactions were common enough to pass without notice, written into the economy of human life that defined the South. Yet this sale, like the names of those it condemned, would never be forgotten. The record described him simply as a trader from Natchez. His name was Jonas Crow. No one in the parish seemed to know where he came from or what business he conducted beyond the road. He was a tall, thin man with hands too clean for field work and eyes that never lingered long enough for comfort. Some said he dealt in horses. Others said he trafficked in something far more profitable: souls on the edge of the law. The kind sold quietly and without question. Crow traveled light, carried few possessions, and kept his papers in a satchel that never left his side. When he appeared in Street Landry Parish, he spoke with a soft confidence that drew little suspicion. He paid his 3 cents per child without hesitation, counted the coins aloud, and signed the ledger with a practiced flourish. To those watching, it seemed almost routine, an errand performed by a man accustomed to handling unpleasant business. But what unsettled the witnesses most was his composure. He neither smiled nor frowned, simply gathered the infants wrapped in scraps of linen and turned away before anyone thought to ask where he was headed. That afternoon, a few saw his wagon vanish into the low fog rolling off the river road. The wheels cut narrow tracks through the mud, heading west toward Natchez, where the markets were said to be less discerning. No one followed. In a world where human life had a price, curiosity was a luxury. Days later, the parish was quiet again. But along the river crossing, the ferryman spoke of something strange. He claimed that late one night, through the mist, he heard crying 2 voices, thin and uneven, echoing across the water. By the time he reached the bank, the sound had vanished. All he found were faint wheel marks leading into the trees and the broken handle of a small wicker basket washed against the reeds. Some dismissed it as a story born from superstition. Others swore it was the truth. Jonas Crow was never seen in Street Landry Parish again. The ledger preserved his name, but history did not. Over the following months, rumors drifted along the trade routes of a man who had tried to sell infants to a riverboat captain, of a stranger who left town suddenly after an argument over missing cargo, of a traveler whose wagon was found empty along a flooded road outside Natchez. No one could confirm any of it. The records ended where the river began. In time, the story of the trader from Natchez became less about the man and more about what he represented. He was a shadow in human form, a symbol of the machinery that made cruelty ordinary. Men like Crow thrived in the spaces between law and conscience, where ledgers could be rewritten and witnesses could forget. He did not invent evil, he only carried it from one town to the next, cloaked in civility and signed in ink. The twins' trail disappeared with him, swallowed by the fog and the silence that followed. But even silence leaves echoes. On certain nights, when the mist rises thick from the riverbank, locals say you can still hear the faint sound of wheels creaking and the soft cry of children somewhere just beyond sight. The river keeps its secrets well, but it never truly forgets. By the time summer returned to Wildermore, the fields had grown thick again, and the air was sweet with the scent of cane and decay. Nature, indifferent to the cruelties of man, continued its rhythm as if nothing had happened. The river still rose and fell, the cicadas still sang in the heat, and the whitewashed house still gleamed under the relentless Louisiana sun. But to those who worked the land, Wildermore no longer felt alive. It felt haunted. They said it began with a sound. Faint at first, like a breath or the rustle of cloth. Then, clearer, sharper, the cry of a child, thin as a thread, winding through the pines. The sound came mostly at night, when the wind carried low from the river and the world was too still to mistake it for anything else. No one dared to speak of it during daylight, but when the sun went down, the whispers began. Some said the babies had been taken by the swamp, their bodies sunk beneath the dark water where even the fish would not feed. Others said they had been buried near the northern field, where the soil stayed warm no matter the season. And a few swore that the sound was not mourning, but calling that the children of Wildermore were searching for their mother. Marianne was gone by then. Her name was not spoken within the big house, erased from the ledgers and from the lips of those who served. Yet her absence hung heavier than her presence ever had. The cellar where she had been kept was sealed shut with timber boards, but those who passed it said they could feel the chill rising from below, as if the ground itself was trying to breathe. The mistress, Genevieve Calder, avoided that part of the house entirely. She had taken to her room, pale and withdrawn, claiming illness when guests called. At night, she left candles burning in the windows as though the light could ward off guilt. For the enslaved, Wildermore had become a place of omens. They read meaning in the way the pine needles fell, in the shape of smoke drifting from the chimneys, in the cry of a night bird too close to the house. Even the overseer, August Holt, stopped walking the fields after dusk. He told himself it was foolishness, that the sound carried from some distant homestead, yet he found excuses to drink by the fire instead. He had seen too much to truly believe in peace. The stories grew with each passing week. Field hands claimed to see small footprints along the edges of the cane rows after a night of rain, two sets, always side by side, pressed into the mud as if made by children walking barefoot through eternity. When the wind rose, it carried a low, rhythmic hum that reminded some of a mother's lullaby. To others it was something else entirely, a warning that Wildermore's sins had roots deeper than its oldest oak. No record from the period mentions these events, yet oral accounts survived in the memories of descendants who refused to let the story die. They spoke of the cries that haunted Wildermore, the way the sound seemed to move with intention, circling the fields, brushing past the doors, and slipping through cracks in the walls. It was not loud, but it was persistent, steady, alive in the way truth often is when it refuses to be buried. Even now, a century later, when the plantation exists only as ruins swallowed by vines, visitors claim the land is never silent. On humid nights, when the wind drifts through the pine forest and the river sighs against its banks, some swear they can still hear them, the echo of children who never saw the morning, crying for the mother who never stopped listening. The laws that governed Louisiana in the mid-19th century were not written for the living but for the owned. In every courthouse and parish office, the Code Noir, the Black Code, hung like scripture. It was more than a collection of statutes. It was a theology of power, designed to make cruelty orderly and injustice permanent. It gave shape to an empire where humanity could be priced, where suffering was counted in columns and ink. The foundation of that system was a single Latin phrase that outlived generations. Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. Those words turned the miracle of birth into a ledger entry. They made the womb a tool of production, a self-replicating asset. Every child born to an enslaved woman was automatically property of her master, no matter the father's identity or intention. Love, violation, or chance made no difference. The law did not see family, only multiplication. By encoding this rule, Louisiana joined a legacy that reached back through centuries of empire. The Code Noir had been born under French colonial rule, polished by Spanish law, and hardened by the economy of the American South. It dictated how the enslaved could marry, how they could worship, what punishments could be inflicted, and what liberties could be denied. In its clauses, mercy appeared only as a technicality. Even the so-called rights it offered rest on Sundays, the right to baptism, the prohibition against killing without cause were written not to protect people, but to protect investment. In the eyes of the law, Marianne was not a woman carrying life. She was an asset bearing interest. Her children were not children. They were collateral, born into bondage before they took their first breath. The birth of her twins was a moment of biological wonder transformed into a business transaction. The law ensured that no act of violence, no violation of the sacred, could ever disrupt the machinery of ownership. Historians would later call it a system of contradictions, one that quoted scripture while breaking every moral it claimed to uphold. Planters who saw themselves as gentlemen recited verses about providence even as they signed bills of sale for newborns. Clergymen blessed marriages that could be dissolved by the stroke of a pen. Politicians in Baton Rouge and New Orleans debated tariffs and infrastructure while quietly defending the sanctity of this order, insisting that it preserved civilization itself. For those who lived beneath it, the Code Noir was more than law, it was the invisible chain that stretched from mother to child, from one generation to the next. It was why families were broken before they could begin, why hope had to live in whispers and prayer instead of promise. Every plantation ledger, every parish record, every courthouse wall echoed its command: birth is commerce. Today, copies of the Code Noir survive in archives, their pages brittle, their language archaic. Yet to read them is to feel the chill of intent still pulsing through the ink. These were not relics of ignorance but of design, a blueprint for turning humanity into inventory. And though time has buried many of the names once bound by its clauses, the consequences remain etched in the soil. The law of flesh, as it was once called, did not end with the page. It ended only when blood and memory refused to obey it. In the summer of 1855, a year after the sale that no one was supposed to remember, a rumor began to drift downriver toward New Orleans. It came by way of merchants, ferrymen, and travelers carried like pollen through conversation. The story was of a woman who had given birth in chains on a plantation upriver, and of her children sold for less than the price of a sweet. At first, few believed it. The South was full of horror dressed as gossip, and most atrocities vanished into the silence that power demanded. But this one found its way into print. The man who broke that silence was a journalist named Edwin Lafferty, a quiet abolitionist who wrote for a small paper called the Crescent Ledger. He was young, idealistic, and reckless enough to believe that words could wound an empire. In an article published that July, he described an abominable sale conducted in Street Perfect for Landry Parish, in which 2 infants were transferred as property under the authority of law. He gave no names, no exact locations, only the outline of a truth that was too familiar to be ignored. To the readers in New Orleans coffeehouses, it was a story of outrage. To the planters upriver, it was an act of war. Within days, the article reached Wildermore. Colonel Thaddeus Calder read it at his breakfast table, his hand tightening around the newspaper until the print smudged against his palm. The accusation was vague, but unmistakable. The description of the house, the parish, the river, every detail pointed too closely to him. That afternoon, messengers rode out to summon the parish magistrate, the sheriff, and the clerk of court. By evening, an emergency meeting had been convened in the courthouse, behind doors that shut the truth out as efficiently as they shut the heat in. What followed was not an investigation but a rehearsal. Witnesses were chosen carefully, their testimonies rehearsed before being recorded. The midwives who had been present that night were called forward, questioned briefly, and escorted away under watch. The clerk, Ephraim Pruitt, whose careful handwriting had immortalized the sale, was ordered to produce his ledger. He arrived pale and trembling, the book pressed to his chest like a shield. By the time he left the room, the ledger was no longer his. The parish declared the report a fabrication, slander upon respectable citizens, they called it, and the original article was banned from reprint. Within a week, the Crescent Ledger was raided. Edwin Lafferty's printing press was destroyed, and his name vanished from public record. Some said he fled north, others said he drowned trying to cross the Mississippi under cover of night. No one ever found his body, and no newspaper in Louisiana dared mention his work again. The official statement from Street Landry Parish was brief and absolute. No such transaction took place within this jurisdiction. Reports to the contrary are false, malicious, and injurious to the peace of the community. But silence is not truth. Over time, the scandal became something half-remembered, a rumor preserved in whispers and letters. Yet fragments endured, phrases copied into diaries, notes found in ledgers, an unsigned letter tucked between pages of a family Bible. Together, they formed the outline of a story that refused to die. History has many ways of keeping secrets, but it has just as many ways of remembering them. The ledger may have been hidden, the witnesses silenced, and the journalist erased, but the echo of what happened at Wildermore still clings to the soil. In every parish that built its wealth on silence, the same lie was told: there was no scandal. But the truth never needed to shout, it only needed to survive. By the end of 1856, the overseer of Wildermore Plantation was no longer the man he once pretended to be. August Holt, once rigid in posture and quick in command, had begun to decay from the inside. The signs were small at first: a slower step on the fields, a flask that appeared more often in his hand, the hollow stare of a man who feared the silence of his own thoughts. The other workers whispered that he had been touched by something unholy, that the ghosts of the past year had found their way into his mind. In truth, it was not the spirits that haunted him but memory, his own participation in a cruelty so complete that no scripture, no drink could cleanse it. He had been the one to fetch the midwives, the one to keep the door barred as Mary Ann's cries rose from the cellar, the one to watch as the twins were carried away in the morning light. And though he told himself he had only followed orders, the echoes of those sounds had settled inside him like rust. His nights became battlegrounds between drink and conscience. Neighbors heard him shouting in his sleep, fragments of phrases no man should ever have to say aloud. "Babies in chains," he would mutter. "Don't let them cry anymore." By winter, Holt had stopped attending church. The preacher's voice made his hands tremble. He drank through the sermons instead, sitting on his porch and staring out toward the cypress grove that bordered the swamp. The same grove where years of unmarked graves lay hidden beneath the moss. It was said he often walked there at dusk, speaking to no one, moving as if following footsteps only he could hear. The other men avoided that path after dark. The plantation itself had grown quieter since the scandal. The Calders remained in their house, withdrawn from the social circles they once ruled. Genevieve's health had declined, and Thaddeus Calder's reputation had begun to rot in polite conversation. But it was Holt who bore the living curse. His authority over the enslaved had dissolved. His orders no longer carried weight. When he shouted, the words fell flat, as if even the air refused to obey him. The night before he died, rain swept across the bayou, a hard and restless storm that bent the trees and rattled the shutters. No one saw him leave his quarters. In the morning the storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and still. A field hand found him first, hanging from a cypress limb at the edge of the swamp, his body swaying gently above the muddy ground. In his pocket was a small child's rattle carved from wood, its paint worn away, its handle smoothed by touch. No one could say where he had gotten it, though some believed it had belonged to one of the twins. The Calders ordered his death recorded as an accident, another casualty of drink and despair. The local paper ran a short notice, noting his years of loyal service. But in the quarters, the story spread differently. They said the swamp had called him, that the cries he had tried to silence had finally answered. Today, the tree still stands, its bark split and darkened with age. Travelers who pass along the old river road sometimes stop beneath it, claiming they hear faint creaking, even when there is no wind. Whether it is the sound of rope or memory, no one can say. But the land remembers what men like August Holt tried to forget. It always does. Winter in Louisiana carried a different kind of silence. The cane fields stood bare, their stalks cut down to brittle stumps, and the air was thick with smoke from the burning season. The land seemed to sleep, but beneath that stillness, a pulse of unrest stirred. It began with a letter, written in haste, and smuggled through hands that risked their lives to carry it. The letter bore no seal, only a name scratched faintly across the fold. Mary Ann. The letter had come a long way north from Cincinnati, then through Memphis, Vicksburg, and down the river in secret channels of trust. It passed from abolitionist to boatman, from preacher to freedman, each person carrying it one step closer to a woman who was not supposed to receive mail at all. It was written by Samuel, Mary Ann's brother, who had fled the South years earlier through the veins of the Underground Railroad. He had escaped under cover of night, his name erased from the plantation where he was born, but his memory of her never faded. When rumors reached him of a woman in Louisiana who had given birth in chains, he knew before reading further that it had to be her. Samuel's letter was not long, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. He wrote of his freedom, how he had crossed into Ohio and built a quiet life among those who called themselves abolitionists. He described the church basements where former slaves met to plan new escapes, and the faces of those who still bore the marks of their captivity. "You are not forgotten," he wrote. "I have heard what was done, and I will come for you, no matter the cost." The words were not poetry, but they were defiance in ink. In a world that denied her even a name, it was a declaration that someone, somewhere, still believed she existed. The letter reached Wildermore hidden inside a shipment of salt pork, folded within a page of a New Orleans newspaper. A servant who had once been close to Mary Ann found it and risked everything to pass it to her. The act itself was treason against the order that ruled the plantation. Yet even under threat of the whip, the message found its way into her hands. It was said that when she read the letter, she did not weep. She only stared at the words until they blurred, committing them to memory in case the paper was taken away. The news of Samuel's promise carried farther than intended. By the end of that week, whispers spread through the quarters that someone from the North was coming, that freedom was not just a word whispered in hymns, but a path carved in the night. For the enslaved, hope was a dangerous thing. It could be punished more harshly than disobedience. Yet hope spread quietly, like seeds carried by wind. History would later record few details about the letter itself. It was never found, never archived, never mentioned in any official document, but its presence rippled through Wildermore like a tremor. The overseer drank more heavily. The mistress grew more withdrawn. Even Colonel Calder, whose authority had once seemed immovable, began to sense the walls of his world shifting. Some stories say Mary Ann hid the letter in the lining of her dress, carrying it like a talisman against despair. Others believe she burned it after reading, letting the flame consume its evidence but not its meaning. Either way, the words survived not on paper but in motion. They would set events in motion that neither chains nor law could contain. The letter from the North did not bring rescue that day. It brought something more dangerous: belief. And once belief entered Wildermore, nothing that followed could ever truly silence it again. The road south was a long scar through the heart of a divided nation. By the spring of 1857, Samuel had left behind the relative safety of Cincinnati and stepped once more into the territory that had once owned him. He traveled under the name Josiah Carter, carrying forged papers that declared him a freed carpenter seeking work along the river routes. Every mile he walked was an act of defiance, a journey back into the darkness he had escaped. Freedom, he understood, was not a destination but a direction, and his path now led straight into the past. Traveling south as a black man, even with papers, was an act of constant danger. Patrols stopped travelers without cause. Ferrymen asked too many questions, and innkeepers turned away strangers whose faces reminded them of their own guilty consciences. Samuel relied on a network of quiet allies, a patchwork of abolitionists, free black families, and sympathetic souls who risked everything to move him one step closer to Wildermore. They met him at crossroads, barns, and river docks, passing him food, shelter, and whispered instructions. None asked his true name. In those days, names could be death sentences. In Memphis, he worked for 2 weeks repairing window frames in an apothecary shop owned by a man who claimed to hate politics but kept a copy of The Liberator folded beneath the counter. In Natchez, a widow took him in for a night, hiding him beneath the floorboards when riders came looking for a runaway who matched his description. He saw the fear in her eyes as she lowered the trapdoor, the same fear he had carried all his life, and he realized how many people lived their days between courage and collapse. The closer he drew to Louisiana, the more the land itself seemed to change. The air grew heavier, the trees taller, their roots twisting like fingers over the roads. Every field he passed reminded him of the ones he had known as a child, of the rhythm of labor that never truly left his muscles. He saw children in rags, herding livestock, men bent beneath sacks of sugarcane, women moving through rows of cotton with the same mechanical grace of generations before them. To the world, these were anonymous lives. To Samuel, they were mirrors. He traveled mostly by night, guided by stars and the faint, familiar patterns of the river. The Mississippi became both compass and warning, its vast waters carrying whispers of escape and betrayal alike. More than once, he thought he was being followed. The crunch of footsteps in the brush. The flicker of a lantern too steady to be coincidence. He learned to trust the silence more than sound. Silence, he discovered, was what survival truly sounded like. In Baton Rouge, he met a preacher named Reverend Isaiah Ford, a man who disguised the Underground Railroad as a ministry. The Reverend's sermons were coded maps, his psalms the coordinates of deliverance. "The Lord's house," he would say, "has many doors, but only one path leads north." It was Ford who gave Samuel the final directions, the backwater roads that curved through the parishes and into Street Landry, the shadowed trail that led toward Wildermore. Before they parted, the Reverend pressed a worn Bible into his hand. Inside, between the pages of Exodus, was a folded map drawn in charcoal and a single sentence: "You are not returning alone." By the time Samuel crossed the Louisiana border, the world around him felt both familiar and foreign. The landscape of his childhood had not changed, but he had. He no longer looked at the plantation lights with fear, but with a cold, patient clarity. Each flicker on the horizon was a story waiting to be reclaimed, a piece of history that refused to stay buried. As he drew closer to Wildermore, Samuel knew he was walking into a place where ghosts still breathed. He was not a rescuer or a savior, but a brother returning for what the world had tried to erase. The journey had taken months, and yet it felt like a single heartbeat stretched thin across distance and time. He did not know if Marianne still lived, but faith had carried him this far. And faith, in those years, was the most dangerous weapon a black man could wield. When Samuel finally reached Street Landry Parish, the air felt different, thicker, older, charged with the memory of things that refused to die. The fields of Wildermore stretched wide beneath a gray sky, their cane stubble blackened from the last burn of the season. The great house rose from the earth like a monument to arrogance, its paint peeling, its columns scarred by storms. He had seen it once before as a boy from a distance, when its white facade still gleamed in the sun. Now it looked tired, a relic pretending to stand against time. He arrived under the guise of a freed carpenter, carrying forged papers and a sack of tools worn from real use. The storm that had struck weeks earlier had torn shingles from the roof and shattered part of the porch, giving him the excuse he needed. Workmen were always welcome at Wildermore. The Calders needed help but distrusted the men who offered it. Samuel played his part, carefully, humble, silent, unremarkable. He kept his eyes lowered but his senses sharp, memorizing every turn of the house, every door, every face. The estate had changed since the days of its grandeur. The fields were thinner, the workers quieter. Superstition clung to the place like heat. Even the Calders seemed ghosts of their former selves. Colonel Thaddeus Calder's stride had lost its confidence, his voice its command. Genevieve drifted through the halls like smoke, her hair silvered, her eyes distant. The great rooms that once echoed with visitors now stood in disuse, their mirrors veiled, their furniture draped. Samuel waited until nightfall to begin his search. He worked quietly along the back of the house, pretending to inspect the storm-damaged shutters, when he found the window, the one half buried in ivy and shadow. Its glass was coated in grime, but through it he saw movement. A faint flicker of lamplight revealed a figure in the darkness below. The face was thin, the skin bruised, the eyes hollow yet defiant. It was her, Marianne. For a long moment, Neither moved. The bars between them seemed more than iron, they were history itself, forged by years of cruelty and distance. But something passed through that silence. Something older than words. Recognition. Blood. The unspoken truth of a bond the world had tried to erase. Samuel pressed his hand to the glass, and though she could not reach him, she mirrored the gesture. The cellar light trembled against her face, catching the trace of tears that refused to fall. In that instant, the years collapsed. All the miles he had traveled, all the nights he had hidden, all the names he had buried to find his way back. They had led to this single, fragile breath of reunion. She was alive, though barely. And in her eyes he saw both exhaustion and will, the faint ember of a spirit that refused extinction. He left before dawn, returning to his quarters without a sound. No one noticed the dirt on his hands or the look in his eyes. Over the following days, he learned the rhythms of the house, how the guards changed, how food reached the cellar, how the Calders slept. Each detail was a piece of the map forming in his mind, a blueprint of escape that would require precision and faith. The night he found Marianne was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Wildermore, that monument of power and silence, had withstood storms, fire, and scandal. But now, for the first time, someone had returned not to survive it, but to unmake it. Summer in Louisiana has a way of turning beauty into danger. The heat builds slowly, pressing down on the land until the air itself begins to shimmer. On the night Wildermore burned, the sky was swollen with storm clouds, and thunder rolled across the horizon like a warning too late to be heeded. The magnolia trees surrounding the estate were in full bloom, their blossoms white against the dark. The scent was sweet, heavy, and almost mournful. What began as a distant rumble of thunder became the sound of reckoning. Inside the house, the Calders moved through their routines, unaware that the storm gathering above them was more than weather. Years of rot had weakened the roof, and when lightning struck the iron weather vane at the peak of the great hall, the fire began silently, an orange bloom in the attic that spread with a breath. By the time the wind caught it, the roof was already a sea of flame. Samuel had been waiting for a moment like this. For days, he had studied the house, learned the habits of its guards, and memorized the creak of every door. When the first shout went up and the bells began to ring, he moved without hesitation. The chaos above gave him cover. Servants ran toward the stables, shouting for buckets and water, while Genevieve Calder screamed orders no one followed. The storm drowned every sound but the roar of fire. In the cellar, the heat came first. The air turning thick, suffocating, alive with the smell of burning wood. The lock on the door had already begun to warp when Samuel reached it. The key he carried, stolen days before, slid into the mechanism with trembling precision. The door groaned open, and the world above poured in a world of smoke, noise, and freedom. Marianne was there, frail but upright, her eyes widening as if she had seen not a man but a promise kept. He helped her stand, her weight light against him, and together they moved through the dark like figures stepping out of a grave. Others followed. Men and women who had been kept below the house for months emerged one by one, shielding their faces from the falling ash. Samuel led them through the servants' corridor, past the kitchen, where embers fell like rain. The air was thick with sparks, and each breath tasted of iron and soot. Outside, the magnolia tree closest to the veranda had caught fire, its blossoms glowing like lanterns before collapsing into embers. The rain began only after the house was fully ablaze, too late to save it, as if the heavens themselves had waited until the lie was consumed. By dawn, nothing of Wildermore remained, but smoldering columns and the cracked outline of its foundation. The house that had once ruled the parish stood as a skeleton of stone and smoke. The Calder's name, once spoken with reverence, was whispered now with fear. Genevieve was found wandering the garden in shock, her hands blackened, her eyes empty. Colonel Calder disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. For Samuel and Marianne, the fire was both ending and beginning. It erased the evidence of their suffering, but it also burned the past into permanence. The land that had thrived on silence finally spoke in flame. Every secret, every cruelty, every whispered command had turned to ash beneath the magnolia tree. What rose from that ruin was not triumph but truth, the kind that could no longer be contained. The empire of Wildermore had fallen, and with it, the illusion that power could outlast justice. The fire at Wildermore left behind more than ruins. It left a silence so deep that even the crickets stopped singing. When dawn rose over the ashes, the land looked stripped of its disguise, as if truth had finally burned its way to the surface. For Marianne and Samuel, there was no time to mourn. Smoke still trailed into the sky like a beacon, drawing attention from nearby towns. Before the embers cooled, they were already gone, two figures moving north along the river, following the current that had once carried their ancestors in chains. The Mississippi was both refuge and threat, a restless artery dividing worlds. On its western banks, freedom shimmered like a mirage. On the eastern, bounty hunters waited with dogs and guns. Samuel knew this landscape by instinct: the winding trails, the half-sunken levees, the old cypress trees that grew like sentinels from the water. Each night they hid beneath their branches, listening to the chorus of frogs and wind, measuring safety by silence. Marianne's health wavered, her steps slow but determined. Her body bore the marks of years in captivity, yet her will carried her farther than strength ever could. They found shelter where they could. A freedman named Elijah Reed took them in near Baton Rouge, his small cabin hidden deep within a sugarcane field. He gave them food and a map drawn on scrap paper, its lines faint but reliable. "North," he said, "the land grows freer." Along the route, they met others. Farmers who had bought their freedom through decades of labor. Women who tended hidden sanctuaries deep in the swamp where fugitives could rest. Abolitionists, disguised as traders moving messages north under the cover of commerce. These people were not just helpers, they were an invisible nation bound by defiance. At night, around the small fires that burned low and blue, Samuel heard rumors that struck him like the echo of a dream. Travelers spoke of a showman who moved from town to town along the Mississippi circuit, exhibiting curiosities and oddities to crowds hungry for spectacle. Among his exhibits, they said, were two light-skinned children, a boy and a girl, nearly the same age, with gray eyes that made people stop and stare. Some thought them orphans, others claimed they were prodigies of nature. The man called them the chain twins of Louisiana. He displayed them in matching garments of white, their wrists adorned with mock shackles carved from polished brass. Samuel said nothing, but the look in his eyes changed. The river's rhythm seemed to quicken beneath his thoughts. Marianne, too, felt the truth before she dared to speak it. The description was too precise, too cruelly specific. Their children, the ones taken from her arms that morning years before, had not vanished into death. They had been turned into a spectacle. The realization was both a miracle and a wound. As they traveled farther north, the scent of ash lingered in Marianne's hair, as if Wildermore refused to release her. The river carried them past towns rebuilt from the ruins of war, past ferries loaded with goods, past plantations that still echoed with the ghosts of the enslaved. Each bend of the river brought new stories, new warnings, and more signs of the world's divided heart. Freedom and horror shared the same banks, often separated only by water. By the time they reached Vicksburg, the rumors had hardened into fact. Posters hung in taverns and market stalls advertised the showman's next exhibition, an evening of curiosities featuring, among other marvels, the chain twins of Louisiana. The sight of those words froze Marianne in place. Her heart did not break, it hardened. The fire that had destroyed Wildermore had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a new kind of reckoning. The Mississippi carried their reflection beside them that night, long and dark and shifting. It was no longer just a river, it was the mirror of history itself, wide enough to hold both salvation and sorrow. They followed it north, not because they were certain of what they would find, but because the river, like memory, would not let them turn back. The traveling carnival had arrived on the outskirts of Vicksburg, just as the summer heat began to fade into the first chill of autumn. Wagons rolled in from the river road carrying tents, lanterns, and wooden platforms still dusted from the last town's soil. By dusk, the field had transformed into a gaudy constellation of torches and banners, their colors bleeding into the night air. For the people who came, it was an escape from the monotony of the plantations and the river docks, a night of music, ale, and spectacle. But beneath the laughter and the glow of oil lamps, the carnival of chains waited. They called it the Wonders of the Delta, a traveling sideshow that boasted curiosities from the exotic corners of the world, painted men from the islands, caged animals half-starved for applause, and a stage where the grotesque was turned into entertainment. The centerpiece of the attraction, however, drew the largest crowds. The posters, nailed to tavern walls and church fences, announced them boldly. The chain twins of Louisiana, born in bondage, blessed by Providence. The crowd came in waves, drawn by morbid fascination, unaware or unwilling to know that what they were about to witness was not a miracle, but a monument to cruelty. On a small wooden platform draped with faded velvet, two children stood side by side. A boy and a girl, their skin pale, their hair light, their eyes the color of storm clouds. Around their wrists gleamed polished brass shackles, linked by a short chain that forced them to move in unison. To the audience, it was performance. Each movement, each smile they were taught to mimic, was a distortion of something sacred. The crowd clapped, coins were thrown, and the showman bowed, tipping his hat to the laughter that fed his livelihood. Behind the illusion of merriment was a man named Silas Vaughan, a former trader turned showman whose fortune had been built not on imagination but on exploitation. He told stories to the crowd of how he had rescued the twins from the ashes of a burning plantation, how they were the living symbols of deliverance from the sins of the South. He never mentioned Wildermore. He never spoke the name of Mary Ann. Instead, he painted himself as savior and businessman, masking greed with theater. When Samuel and Mary Ann reached the edge of that crowd, the night around them seemed to stop breathing. The laughter felt colder, the light harsher. They stood at the boundary between spectacle and truth, looking at the faces of children the world had turned into a commodity. Mary Ann's body trembled not with fear, but with recognition. The shape of their hands, the faint scar on the boy's forearm, the way the girl tilted her head as if listening for something only she could hear. Every detail was proof of what had been stolen from her. The people watching saw only novelty. They did not see the history that lived inside those children, the cellar, the chains, the silence. The performance continued, a grotesque echo of the law that had once called them property. Around them, the crowd cheered, blind to the truth that they were applauding the endurance of their own cruelty. That night, the carnival would pack up and move again, vanishing downriver before sunrise, leaving behind scraps of paper and the faint smell of oil and smoke. But the image of those children, bound together beneath the flickering lanterns, would linger far longer. The laughter that rose from that crowd did not fade with the night. It echoed through history, a reminder that even when the chains are made of brass and the crowd smiles, bondage can still wear the mask of entertainment. The Carnival of Chains was not an aberration. It was the South's mirror one that reflected not monsters, but men. And for Mary Ann and Samuel, standing unseen among the crowd, it became the moment the past turned into purpose. What had been taken in silence would have to be reclaimed in fire. The night the carnival turned to chaos began with rain. It came softly at first, brushing over the Mississippi fields like a warning, then fell harder, drumming against the canvas tents until the entire fairground seemed to breathe. The crowds had thinned, retreating toward the taverns and riverboats, but the lights of the sideshow still glowed in the storm, flickering in defiance of the weather. Behind those dim lights, history was preparing to right itself, not through justice, but through desperation. For days, Mary Ann and Samuel had followed the carnival's route, watching from the edges of towns, hiding in shadows as the wagons rolled from one parish to the next. Each performance was the same: laughter, applause, the mockery of human suffering dressed as entertainment. Every night, the The same two children stood under the lanterns, her children, their wrists gleaming with brass shackles polished by cruelty. They were displayed as curiosities, the chain twins of Louisiana, while their true story was buried under the weight of spectacle. That night, as rain pooled in the dirt, Marianne stepped from the darkness and approached the showman's tent. She was gaunt, exhausted, her dress clinging to her skin, but her eyes were steady. The showman, Silas Vaughan, was counting coins in a tin box when she entered. What passed between them in that moment was not negotiation, it was the collision of two worlds. He saw profit and madness. She saw salvation. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and deliberate. She offered herself for the children's release. To him, it was absurd. To her, it was the last mercy she could give. He laughed, not out of cruelty alone, but from disbelief. The sound cut through the rain like a blade. He told her the twins were his now, that the law was on his side, that paper and ink had made her loss permanent. His words were meant to wound, but they did something else. They called Samuel from the shadows. The weapon he carried was small, old, a pistol smuggled through a dozen hands before finding its way to his. When the barrel lifted, time seemed to still. The storm grew louder, drowning the heartbeat of the world. The shot that followed was not clean. The air filled with the sound of tearing canvas, shouts, and panic. The lanterns crashed, spilling fire and rain together into a confusion of smoke and light. Somewhere amid the chaos, the children screamed, their voices cutting through the downpour. When it ended, the field was emptying. The carnival workers fled into the darkness, the tents collapsing in the wind. Silas Vaughan lay motionless near the stage, the tin of coins scattered in the mud, each piece glinting like a fragment of the life he had stolen. The gun had fallen from Samuel's hand, but the twins were in their arms, terrified, shaking, alive. They ran until the storm swallowed them whole, the Mississippi rising on either side, the night stretching endless ahead. The rain erased their footprints, washing away the traces of what had happened, as if the earth itself refused to bear witness. By dawn, the carnival was gone, nothing left but broken boards and wet ashes. The posters had melted in the rain, their words unreadable. Yet somewhere along the riverbank, 4 figures moved north, 2 adults, 2 children bound no longer by chains of iron or brass, but by blood and the fragile mercy of survival. The world would remember that night as another nameless tragedy. A rumor whispered along the river about a showman struck down by fate. But for Marianne and Samuel, it was the night history split open. Mercy had demanded blood, and the price had been paid in full. The fire and the carnival were behind them, but the Mississippi still had a long memory. Word of the killing spread quickly through the river towns, how a white showman had been shot, how 2 runaways and a pair of light-skinned children had vanished into the night. In a world built on control, nothing threatened order more than fugitives who refused to disappear. Within days, bounty men were on the move, their horses pounding the wet roads that snaked through the flooded lowlands. The storm that had once sheltered Samuel and Marianne now turned against them. Rain fell without pause, flooding the swamps until the land itself became a labyrinth of water and reeds. The sound of hounds carried far through the stillness, echoing across the cypress groves. They moved at night, wading through waist-deep water, carrying the children against their chests to keep them dry. Every step was a negotiation between life and exhaustion. Hunger became constant, sleep impossible. Yet in those moments between breaths, when the frogs went silent and the trees held their breath, they could still feel the old world reaching for them. The bounty men came from both sides of the law. Some were former overseers chasing what they called lost property. Others were hired deputies who justified cruelty as duty. They traveled in small groups, guided by rumors and by the kind of instinct that only years of hunting people could teach. The marsh swallowed the weaker ones, but those who survived grew relentless. To them, the swamps were not wilderness, they were profit. Samuel, once patient and deliberate, began to change. The man who had journeyed south to rescue his sister now carried something darker within him. He had seen the laughter of the carnival crowds, the gleam of the brass shackles on his niece and nephew's wrists, and the smirk of the man who believed ownership never died. That memory became a fire that refused to cool. When he heard the dogs in the distance, he no longer thought of escape. He thought of ending the pursuit. Violence, once foreign to him, became familiar, a trap left behind in the reeds, a torch snuffed out in the dark, a man who did not return to camp by morning. Each act blurred the line between defense and vengeance. Marianne watched the transformation in silence. She understood it, even as it frightened her. The world had taught them both that mercy was a luxury afforded only to the powerful. In the swamps, survival demanded something colder. The children rarely cried. Perhaps they understood the danger, or perhaps the river had already taught them silence. When they rested, they slept in abandoned shacks left by trappers, the walls warped and damp. The wind through the gaps in the boards sounded like whispers, names, prayers, and warnings from the generations that had fled before them. By the time they reached the upper delta, the bounty men had thinned, lost in the endless expanse of mud and fog, but the cost of survival had marked them all. Samuel's eyes had hardened into something unrecognizable. Marianne's hands trembled when she reached for him. Freedom, they realized, was not a clean deliverance. It was a wound that never fully healed. The swamp eventually released them into higher ground, into fields where the stars once again reflected on still water. Behind them, the river carried their ghosts, the lawmen who drowned, the dogs that went silent, the echoes of gunfire muffled by rain. Ahead lay the uncertain promise of the north. Yet the line between salvation and damnation had already blurred. In trying to save his family, Samuel had become the storm that once consumed his captors. And as the river wound northward, its surface, black and unbroken, it carried both their deliverance and their damnation in its depths. The Mississippi has always been both a boundary and a witness. Its waters remember everything, the screams of chains, the songs of those who fled, the bones of those who never made it across. On a gray morning, heavy with fog, that river became the final threshold between bondage and freedom, life and legend. For weeks, Marianne and her small family had followed its course northward, moving through reeds and mud, guided by instinct more than direction. The rains had swollen the river beyond its banks, turning fields into shallow lakes and forests into islands. The air smelled of earth and iron, and each breath carried the weight of exhaustion. Behind them, the world they had fled was collapsing into myth Wildermore reduced to ash, bounty men swallowed by the swamps, the empire of silence fading under the march of time. But the river remained unchanged, vast and indifferent. They reached its edge just before dawn, where the sky bled into the water without distinction. The current was stronger than it looked, black glass streaked with white foam. There were whispers among the freedmen's network of a ferry farther upriver, a safe crossing operated by those who aided fugitives under cover of darkness. But to reach it meant another day of travel, another day of risk. The children were too weak to walk. The sound of pursuit still echoed faintly in the distance. Marianne's body bore the evidence of every mile, the cuts on her feet, the bruises that never faded, the hollowness that came from years of hunger and grief. Yet her face, even in weariness, carried something unbroken. She had lived through chains, childbirth in darkness, the loss of her children, and the fire that had devoured her oppressors. Now, standing before the river, she faced a decision that belonged to no one but her. What happened next would never be recorded in any official document. There would be no witnesses, no statements, no ledger to confirm the truth. The stories that survive were told in fragments passed down through families, whispered by riverboat hands, and written decades later by those who tried to make sense of the silence. Some claimed that she entered the water carrying one child in each arm, waiting until the current lifted her feet from the earth. Others said she found a hidden skiff tied to the reeds, pushed it into the current, and disappeared into the mist before sunrise. A few believed she never reached the river at all, that she and the children found refuge among free black farmers near the Illinois border, living out their lives in quiet anonymity. The river offers no answers. It is the only witness left to that morning, and it does not speak. But what cannot be proved still lingers. Those who have walked the Mississippi's banks on certain fog-heavy dawns swear they have heard it. The sound of water parting softly, like footsteps through memory. They say they have seen faint ripples where no wind blows, a shape that moves with purpose before vanishing into the light. In time, the story of Marianne Calder became both history and hymn. To some, she was a symbol of defiance, a mother who carried her children toward freedom no matter the cost. To others, she was a ghost, claimed by the same river that had swallowed so many before her. But perhaps she was both flesh and myth, sorrow and survival, carried forever in the current. The Mississippi still flows as it did that morning, wide and silent, its surface unbroken. Beneath it lies the sediment of centuries, the ashes of houses, the bones of men, and maybe, somewhere in its depths, the trace of a woman who refused to be owned. The river keeps its secrets. But every now and then, when the mist rises just right, it seems to whisper her name. In the spring of 1902, nearly half a century after the Civil War, the courthouse in Street Landry Parish was undergoing repairs. The white paint had long peeled from its walls, the ironwork rusted, the floorboards warped by decades of southern humidity. The men assigned to restore it treated the job as routine, another relic of an old world being dragged into the new century. But history has a way of waiting patiently beneath plaster and dust, choosing its moment to speak. When the workers pried loose one of the panels behind the clerk's bench, they found a cavity no larger than a suitcase. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, dry despite the years. Within it, time had preserved its own confession, an old ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but legible. It was a record of transactions, deeds, sales, property transfers, entries so ordinary that they might have gone unnoticed if not for one line near the bottom of a page. The handwriting was careful, elegant, and cruelly precise. 2 mulatto infants, property of Wildermore Plantation, sold, 3 cents each. The discovery should have ended there, another grim curiosity from the archives of slavery. But when the foreman turned the page, something else fluttered loose, a smaller scrap of paper, folded once and stained with age. Unlike the clerk's hand, this script was uneven, hurried, written not by an accountant, but by someone who needed to be remembered. The ink had bled in places, but the words were clear enough to stop every man in the room. They were mine. Let the world remember their names. No one could say how it had come to be sealed there. Perhaps a clerk had hidden it out of guilt, or perhaps a mother or someone who loved her had placed it there as a final act of defiance. The parish historian, summoned later that week, called it an anomaly of sentiment. But others felt something different when they touched the fragile paper. The courthouse grew silent, as though even the walls recognized the weight of what they had concealed. News of the find spread slowly, carried by whispers more than headlines. The South, in those years, preferred amnesia to remembrance. Yet for those who read the account, something shifted. The story of Wildermore, of a woman who gave birth in chains, of children sold for less than candy, of fire and flight and silence began to resurface in fragments. The ledger, once a record of property, became a memorial. The names missing from its pages became symbols for all the lives reduced to ink and commerce. No one ever identified the author of that note. Some claimed it was Marianne herself, written in a moment of courage before the river took her. Others believed it was Samuel, who returned in secret years later to ensure his sister's truth could not be erased. Whoever wrote it had understood what history so often forgets, that paper endures longer than flesh, and memory, once named, cannot be chained again. Today, the ledger rests in a museum, preserved under glass. Visitors lean close to read the faded entry and the note beside it. Some linger longer than they expect to, drawn not by curiosity but by something quieter, a recognition of grief too deep to belong to one century alone. And when they leave, the sound that follows them is not the creak of the courthouse floorboards or the echo of hammers from long ago. It is the murmur of the Mississippi, far away but eternal, carrying with it the weight of every name the world tried to forget. In the end, the story does not close with justice or triumph. It closes with remembrance, the sound of water moving steadily toward the horizon, and the faint, imagined rattle of chains that no longer bind but simply drift, carried away by time.